Hey, what's going on? This is Kyle.
And this is Terrell, and this is Offstage.
This is the podcast where we step off stage and get to talk about what's going on in the church and in our lives.
This week, we're going to talk about working on the church when the pandemic has made it difficult to work in the church. Well, Kyle, I'm excited to do this podcast. I know this is something you've been thinking about for a little while, and a good way to get some of the conversations that me and you have and the staff have that are behind the scenes out in front of our people. Because I mean, there's only so much we can say from the stage, and so yeah, I'm excited. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to do something like this?
Yeah, I think during the pandemic we kind of jumped and were kind of thrown into the world of video and podcasts, and we saw really quickly. It gives us an opportunity to have conversations. It gives us an opportunity to talk about things that we normally don't. And then, like you said, most of the time that we get with our people is in a sermon, on stage 20 to 30 times a year. And we love that time to preach and to teach God's word. But there's a lot of things that I think we would like to go into that really don't fit into a sermon. And then there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes at Mosaic that we really only get to talk to people about in one-on-one settings, and a lot of people just don't really know what's going on week to week. So I think this gives us an opportunity to talk about things going on at Mosaic. It also gives us a chance to talk about things that's going on in our culture and our families. So we really don't know where we're going over the next months, but it feels like there's always things going on in our lives, in the world, and this just gives us a platform beyond the sermon to just really be talking with each other and with our people, and then even getting to engage with them about what's going on in their lives and how we can walk alongside of them. So I think it's going to be fun to jump in and just talk a little bit about what's going on in life. Yeah,
I'm excited to do that. There's so much, on Sunday that we want to get out, that, like you said, a lot of the, I would say the really important sustaining stuff, you know what I mean? Sunday is like you prepare all week, you deliver it, and then it's kind of gone. You can listen to it on podcasts, but there's so much that goes into church that is not preaching, and there's so much that goes into the organization that's not preaching. And so, yeah, I think this would be a great opportunity to talk more broadly and to bring people on in the entire journey of Mosaic. So it seems like what's appropriate to begin this particular podcast on is kind of where we've been over the last 6 months, like you mentioned. Coronavirus, the pandemic, the cultural tension. There's a ton that's gone on in the world in the last 6 months. Can you give us just a window into what's gone on inside Mosaic for the last 6 months? What have been the tensions? What have been the things that we've been wrestling through that would be good for our people to know?
Yeah, I think it's hard to even think back 6 months. 6 months feels like a few years ago. But really, I think even before that, so November 2019, you and I and Jeff Batters took a trip to Belton, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, we were exploring building options. What does our future look like? We took a trip to Belton to look at a building that we wanted to just check out. And the executive pastor of the church showed us around. Beautiful building, story very similar to ours as a church. They had been in a school gym for a long time. Finally got to a place where they were ready to built a beautiful building. And really, his words to us were, the building didn't make things simpler. The building actually created so many more problems that at some point almost took out the entire church staff.
Right.
And his whole thing was we didn't have the infrastructure in place to sustain what the building would create. And I think it was one of those times for us where it was a little bit of a gut check that we want to move forward, we want to build, we want to do all these things. And honestly, for a lot of us, because we've been at McMichael, because set up and tear down were such a beast, I think we thought the building would solve all our problems. And we kind of just had this dream of the grass is going to be greener, we'll have a building, life will be sweet. And I think hearing that was a good reality check, that there were some internal things we needed to do to be ready to move forward. And so that was in November. Thankfully, right after that, the elders, we were in the middle of trying to just figure out what it looked like to organizationally get healthy. Garth Hens, one of our elders, recommended bringing in a consultant from Dallas named Leonard. And so Leonard had come in really right around the time coronavirus started. And really kind of what I think would be helpful to talk about for a few minutes today. In the last 6 months, God has given us time, not just to work in the organization, but to work on the organization. And I think we've been doing all the videos and behind the scenes things to keep church going during the pandemic. We also really saw this as a chance for us to step back a little bit. And in a time when ministry, the visible part of ministry wasn't as apparent, it was a time for us to kind of re-examine what does health look like? Who are we as a church? Does all of our staff know that? And so I think that's really what has been this 6-month journey for us. And it feels like we're just now kind of coming out of this season of uncertainty, this season of trying to get healthy. But God gave us this opportunity, I think, to slow down in terms of the way that our ministries ran, and to just do a check of, are we healthy? If not, how do we get there? And it feels like we've taken some big steps forward that I think our staff has seen, but because our people haven't been together in a long time and we're just now starting to get back together, I think just sharing with our people what's been going on will be helpful for them to see as well.
Yeah. The language of working on the business as opposed to in the business is a really important distinction, or working on the church versus in the church. Because I mean, especially in the fall, as soon as the fall hits, I mean, there's not much time to work on the church. You are working in the church. It just feels like that's when we ramp up, and there's so much week by week, deadline by deadline that you got to meet and you got to hit, that the overall organization and the healthy organization just gets lost, and it's understandable, but it's not who we want to be. It's not where we want to go. It's not the kind of church we want to have. And so yeah, Leonard was extremely helpful in that. You've used a phrase over the last 6 months referring to the pandemic, that it's like we've lost the queen, like referring to chess, and queen being the queen being like the Sunday morning peace. Mm-hmm. Unpack that just for a minute. That phrase that you use it with the staff, but I don't know if most people get to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's like most organizations and most businesses. There is a front porch, most visible part of any business, and for us it's obviously Sunday morning, Sunday evening now, but the worship service is where you encounter the majority of the people. It's where we preach. It's where we lead worship. So the bulk of what most new people see happens on Sunday morning. And so while we love and value that time, our worship services, we also acknowledge that the bulk of ministry probably happens outside of that hour and a half. And what tends to happen in most churches is that hour and a half can take up all your time, all your energy. You're putting so much into that hour and a half that the entire rest of the week, you're kind of trying to catch up and recover and then plan another one. And no one intends for it to happen, but that hour and a half begins to become all that you do. So that phrase of the queen, it was an image that I heard a man use in a podcast about the pandemic. And he was talking about how his dad trained him to play chess as a kid. He said his dad would set up the board, but then take the queen off the board, because everybody learns that the queen can move any direction and do anything. And if you take that piece away, you actually learn what the other pieces do and how to use them well. And then once he learned the other pieces, he gave him the queen back. And so he was just talking in the midst of the pandemic that while we lose the worship service, which is most churches' queen, it's what we try to teach through, disciple through, engage new people through, disciple old people. Like, we try to do all that in that 1 hour and a half. And some of it's effective, some of it we need to kind of look at. But even for us, losing that for the months that we lost it, we had to really evaluate, are the other things that we do outside of the worship service effective, and really kind of come to the conclusion that it's easy for us to put so much into that, and then to not have infrastructure as a staff, to not have healthy small groups, to not have discipleship mechanisms, that even if the hour and a half goes well, the rest of the church isn't going that well because we're bringing people into something that's not very well developed. And so I think it's been helpful for us to see that and to be able to have some time just to address what should church look like and what should our time as a staff look like, and how do you not lose the emphasis on Sundays that we think is important, but also realize there's more to church than that hour and a half, and we have to really make wise decisions. It involves the way we operate and use our time.
Yeah. It's interesting that hour and a half gets so much of our time, but it also has so many limitations as far as actual discipleship goes. There's a degree of discipleship that can happen in a group teaching, But it is severely limited in its ability to create and sustain disciples, which is really what we're here to do. So, yeah, so that's interesting. Would you get specific then on, as far as working on the organization, what are some of the I would say decisions and movements and changes that have happened on the organization itself over the last few months, especially as Leonard's come in and really been, he's kind, but he's honest. You know what I mean? Yeah. He's come in, he's been very honest about what he sees in the organization and helped us get honest. So could you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so Leonard has implemented a system that's called EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. He typically works with businesses, not churches. I think we were one of the first churches he's worked with. So to have an outsider who his role is to be a coach for organizations, whether they're businesses, nonprofits, churches, that just desire to be healthy organizations, to have him come in from the outside, it was incredibly helpful for us because this is the world we live in, and we see some of the issues. We don't see some of them because they're just our lives. And I think the reason that that's really important for a church, we have to learn to navigate between two kind of extremes. One is church is messy, and so we've preached about this before. We've talked about this before. Anywhere there are people, there's going to be mess, and I think to try to do away with the mess, you've killed the church. You can also embrace that and kind of almost be okay with messy, the difference between being messy and being sloppy.
Right.
And it felt like, because the job of a pastor involves preaching and counseling and leading, we spend a lot of our time preaching and counseling, and that's where you're dealing with a lot of the mess, and you have to be okay with walking with people through stuff. And so you kind of just get used to the mess of people's lives. And we didn't want that to bleed into a sloppy organization. And so Leonard really came in, and the preaching and counseling side was kind of taken off the table. And the leading side, which I think is the hardest part, and it's the part that most pastors receive the least training for, he kind of started there with us. And it ended up being all-day meeting with the entire staff in May, 2 more all-day meetings in June and July. So it was 3 all-day meetings with the entire staff, where we just kind of started from scratch in terms of the way we're structured with accountability, who's in what seat, who's doing what are the major departments of our church. And so some things that we were just kind of trying to operate on the fly, and we all had our responsibilities, but they were, I would just say, loosely scattered throughout the organization. And one of the big breakthroughs was all of our staff is pastoral staff. We've hired people to do ministry. And as Leonard came in from the outside, with most businesses, you have the operations side, which we were heavy in. You also have kind of the behind the scenes admin, communications, these people that in most businesses not many people see, but if they're not there, the thing falls apart. And so I think for a guy like Leonard, he walked in and probably immediately was like, "What are y'all doing?" And it wasn't.
I think he thinks that a lot sometimes.
Yeah. And it wasn't that people weren't working hard. It was that there were major holes organizationally. Right. And then we were all collectively, I think, trying to jump in and plug the holes, but none of us were great at it. And then there was a lot of miscommunication along the way. And so I think just him coming in and implementing some structure in terms of what our departments are, who sits in what seat, do they want to be there, are they gifted enough to fill that role, and then just communication throughout organizations, starting with the elders and staff. And then hopefully what the people of Mosaic and beyond will start seeing is just a clean, unsloppy, still the messiness of ministry and people and all that is always going to be there. But in terms of an organization that is effective, is efficient, people know what they're doing, why they're doing it, that side of things, it feels like has changed a lot. And I would just say that the staff from the May focus day to the July focus day went from when Leonard started the day and asked how we were all doing. It was depressing. It was in the middle of a pandemic, and we were all, I think, exhausted, discouraged. Loved church, but we're exhausted by working in the church. And again, taking that time out to work on the church and say, we're going to burn ourselves out. Like, we're all working as hard as we can, and just feels like that wheel is just spinning, but there's no traction to it at all. And so it just felt like between that first meeting, that third one, when he left, it feels like people were excited, invigorated, knew what they were doing. And still, there's going to be hard parts of this, but the hard work actually feels productive because there's structure to allow it to work. So
yeah, I think that's it. It seemed like there was hard work before that. It was a lot of times not productive organizationally, and it seems like now there's. It seems like we're at the beginning of a long journey, but at least now it's like it does seem from the inside that we have a way of seeing what problems are most important and how to deal with those problems instead of just what's the weekly deadline, how to deal with the major organizational problems. And then the meeting structure has been massively shifted. And that has been incredibly helpful. Like when we sit down for 90 minutes in a meeting, it really feels like we come out of that meeting knowing what we need to do for the next 7 days as far as the organization goes. And then there's accountability whether it gets done or not. So I think that's been a huge part for me. That's been extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I would even say I think in 15 years, it's the first time that I've seen the elders really know what their seat is, what they're supposed to be doing there. The staff really know what their seat is. There's so many people in leadership at a church that if you're not really, really intentional to define who's doing what, people just kind of step over each other, usually not intentionally,
Right.
but everybody's trying to be helpful, but it ends up people get crossed up and it just causes a lot of confusion. And so I think for us to be in a place now where it feels like everybody knows what seat they sit in, why they're there, what they're supposed to do there, and it leads to, I think, the morale of the staff and elders improving, and then everybody gets to kind of specialize where they need to be and where God's kind of gifted them to be in a way that if you don't clarify it, you're just kind of spinning around, being busy but not productive.
Yeah, and you've kind of said, generally speaking, about the accountability chart and who's doing what, and we've identified the four major areas of the church being communications, which is internal, external communications, it's website, it's graphics, where nobody sat. I mean, there's an enormous amount of work and nobody sat there. So having Blake jump in there and own that has been enormous. Yeah. I mean, hopefully people have seen just through social media and through the communications through the website, that's been cleaned up because that was this enormous job that you just kind of took on, and made it function and made it work, but it sucked your time. So there's communications that we've jumped into.
I thought you were just gonna say it sucked. So thanks for finishing that sentence.
Yeah, it sucked your time. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll take that.
And then admin, we're recognizing what needs to be done in admin, what's priority there, and then all of the ministries, having somebody sit over all of the ministries and who's going to organize and so that they're pulling in the same direction, not pulling against each other. And then the production side, which has been fun for me to recognize. I enjoy that. I enjoy making the production thing happen, the Sunday evening thing happen. So
I've never been more proud of our team. And I think even Leonard, his ability, him stepping in and seeing us and the level of transparency and the level of everybody being a team player, it felt like we basically made it real simple. Here's what has to happen for the church to function. And people stepping into roles that we didn't necessarily hire him for. So Blake's a great example. Blake stepped in and has taken communications to a place that we would have never been able to take it. And like for the people who've enjoyed the videos over the course of the pandemic, and even since we've been at NAC Bible, having video podcasts, just social media looking different, is because Blake owned it. Jamal stepping into next gen ministries and really leading in a way that he hadn't before. And so across the board, I think our staff has just owned what it feels, what is required for us to be a team and to be a pretty small staff that has a lot of things to do and just the focus that's required. So I'm proud of our team for bringing Leonard in and being pretty blunt with each other about we've got to change some things or this isn't going to work, and then being willing to do whatever was needed to do to make it work. So it's been rewarding to see that.
Good. Is there anything else that you feel like would be important in this podcast for the people to know that's gone on inside the organization?
So this will kind of bridge into our next podcast, but the two things that really Leonard spent his time on, the first is the staff and the organization having a clear accountability chart, and we're not going to walk through it all. We'd be happy to sit down with people who want to know more details about that, but that was kind of step one. Step two is what we called our vision day, and it was really 2 days where we had to kind of reevaluate, why are we here? Is it working? Where are we headed? And get real specific. And so it really did take 2 days and take a lot of us bouncing ideas off and kind of evaluating a lot of the things we've said in the past and wanted to be about in the past, and ask questions, is that who we are? And so people who've been around Mosaic have heard, enact as it is in heaven. And we've always meant that, but we never had more clarity about how does that play out, right, and how do you measure that? And so when we sat down together, walking through the vision of our church, and we left with a phrase that if people have been around on Sunday morning or Sunday evening, they may have heard thrown around a little bit, but it's we're pursuing connection with every door, every dorm, every social network in Nacogdoches. That was kind of what we identified as our 10-year target. This is what in 10 years. So in 2030, how do we know that we've been effective as an organization? And that's kind of the way we phrased it, was every door. So every neighborhood and house in Nacogdoches, every dorm, the campus of Stephen F. Austin, then all the social networks that exist within this town. We think God has called us to meaningfully connect with people, engage them, be their friends, love on them, share the gospel with them, hopefully have them join our family. That when that kind of clicked in, I think it refocused all of us on what are the things we're saying yes to, what are the things we're saying no to, and then really what I'd like to talk about in our next podcast. It allowed us to shift the programs, the way we do the kids ministry, youth ministry, college ministry, adult ministry, the way that we look at groups. So everything that we do as a church now has to be connected to that 10-year target. And so it's allowed us to have a filter through which we can say, this is effective. This is helping us head towards that 10-year target. And then to be brutally honest and say, this isn't really helping. And it's not that it's a bad thing, but if this is where we're trying to get in 10 years, we're going to have to learn to say no to some good things to do what we think is best. And so we're only, 2 months into that journey. Right. But the decision-making process for us as a staff, and even for me as I've been meeting with our adult group leaders, it's just kind of given us a laser focus of what are we doing when groups gather together on the nights that they gather? Are we just hanging out? What is it supposed to be like? And I think just is filled the church and our ministries with a focus of, we really do have a mission. That's not just language that we use. There's a place we're trying to get, and our decision making has to line up with the process and the path it's going to take to get to where we want to go. So we'll talk a lot more about that, but there's a 10-year target that came out of our time with Leonard, and then it led to the birth of what we're calling microchurches. Microchurches, the language we use for groups now across the board. And so we had used a bunch of different names across our ministries. And microchurches really is a place where our serve teams and our groups kind of mesh together. And it's really the vehicle through which we think that 10-year target is going to take place, that God is going to spread these little microchurches of people throughout doors, dorms, social networks, and we're going to be able to see connection with people that leads to transformation in our city. So there's way too much to go into on that for this month, but those two things, I think, even personally, have reinvigorated me. I love preaching. I love Sunday nights. I also don't want to get to the end of my life and have been a Christian event planner. And like, that's what it can start to feel like, is you pulled off another really good weekly event, but in terms of the transformation of the city and in terms of the discipleship of the people, that takes a lot of internal work that I think we've been wanting to do and to see developed well. And so that's where we're heading. It's felt fruitful and exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the picture that's been in my mind is, a church has functioned a certain way and gone a certain direction for a very long time. And it wasn't a bad direction. It was a good direction, but it's worn tracks and then so when you're a church, you kind of follow along in the tracks, and since those tracks they're worn so deeply, it kind of takes you in that direction. Groups tend to become what most groups always are, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's it's just kind of this thing you do, and Sunday nights can turn into that same thing as well, and so it really does take intentionality for us to say, okay, where is God pointing us? And then as he actually points us in that direction, there's an enormous amount of intentionality to kind of get out of those ruts and get out of those tracks and go the direction that he is leading us as a church. And yeah, I'm super excited about the social network piece. I think there's so many people that I get to interact with that are, that they're probably not going to go to a church, but they're great people want to get to interact with them more, and I want a platform for doing that. And it feels like the church is saying, yes, go interact with other people. This is not about like try to find everybody and get them to come to this church, because that will never be an effective method of people seeing really the beauty of what Jesus does for human beings, like what he can be for a human being and what he wants to do through human beings. It's not going to just fit inside this little Sunday night experience, and so I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and it feels like exactly what healthy organizations are supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't do organizations because we love organizations. We do organizations because it gives support to living organisms.
Right.
And I think Acts 6, when there was a need in the city, the church brought up deacons who met those needs. And I think for us, even to think about it like the skeletal system in our body,
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to see it, but if you don't have it, you're a blob.
It's weird.
Like,
yeah.
And I think for us, like, we don't want to get to a place where we do org charts and all of that for fun.
Mm-hmm.
None of it's fun, but it's all so essential for us to be healthy. And
Right.
then it felt like we had plateaued, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
We got to this place where growth had happened. God had done good things. And so none of it was bad, but I think we were hitting walls that the lack of our skeletal system being healthy
Right.
it was just indicative of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think now we're going to have to keep learning how to grow and learning that there's these cycles that we have to walk through where we structure and it works for a while. And then as you grow, you have to constantly be asking the Lord for wisdom to allow growth to keep happening. And so it feels like we finally have room to fulfill our mission. And the in that because it's in heaven doesn't feel like a clever marketing. It feels like we can actually answer the question, how does that happen? And it still is slow, and a person at a time, a life at a time. It's still messy because people are messy. It's still sometimes discouraging because there's ups and downs, but it feels like we're doing what, when you read scripture, exactly what they were doing, which was transforming cities by being super intentional, a person at a time, a house at a time, a neighborhood at a time. And so I think just what God has in store for Mosaic, the partnership he led to with NAC Bible, there's just things going on that only he can do. And it brings back to, I think, the first podcast we did when the pandemic started, and we talked about Kairos moments. And at that point, had no idea what was going to happen with NAC Bible. And we were talking about obstacles and opportunities. And in this pretty brutal year, with so many more obstacles that I've had to learn how to navigate as a pastor, the opportunities that he's laid before us also have been pretty incredible. And so I think being in this place now where we're looking forward, seeing the way that God's leading us, and really it has been exactly what we prayed for, which is show us a step at a time where you want us to go, and then let us be faithful there. And it feels like he's brought us into a new season, and I'm really excited for people to be back. It feels like they're slowly trickling back in. So if you haven't been back to church, can't wait for everybody to be back. But there really are. There's, I think, going to be the same excitement on Sundays. I've always loved our Sundays. It feels like there's now some things to back that, to where Sundays don't feel like we're bringing people in and then don't have the infrastructure in place to help them grow and help them fulfill what God created them to do. So it's been good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing, Kyle. If you're a part of Mosaic Church, one, we're excited about where we're going. We're excited about where we're headed. We would love for you to pray for us, pray for wisdom as we're stepping out into a new organizational journey. Would you pray for wisdom? Would you pray for energy? And then would you also consider what role you might play in this organization, where you might serve? It could be something like welcome team. Maybe there is a social network or a neighborhood or a dorm that you feel particularly drawn to. Like, we would love to equip you through what Kyle's been talking about with micro churches, equip you to be a positive presence there. So consider where you might jump in there. There's, of course, within our ministries, holes that we are now seeing where we need people to jump in the different ministries. So just consider where you feel drawn, where you feel the Holy Spirit kind of wake you up to jump in. And I think you'll find there is a ton of life, great experience, difficulty that's meaningful as you jump in and press forward with us. So thanks for catching up with us.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in, you can go to the Belong tab. If you want to know what a microchurch is, we'll be talking about it next podcast. But you can go to the Belong tab and just check out. It'll describe what they are. There's some that are already running. And then we'll be back with more information on the next podcast.